I lay on the cold exam table expecting to see my baby's heartbeat, but instead, I saw my new doctor's face turn ghost white. She did not just see a fetus, she saw a death sentence ticking inside my womb, planted by the man I called my husband. What I thought was a perfect marriage was actually a lie worth billions of dollars. The metal object on the screen was not a mistake. It was feeding on me. My name is Elena, and lying to my husband was the first dangerous thing I had done in our entire marriage. The relentless Seattle rain battered the windows of the private clinic, matching the rhythm of my anxious heart. At 34 years old and 7 months pregnant, I should have been glowing with maternal anticipation. Instead, I was sneaking around like a criminal. My husband, Julian, a renowned obstetrician whose waiting list was measured in years rather than months, had insisted on handling my prenatal care exclusively at home. He called it absolute safety. I called it suffocation. I just wanted a second opinion, a simple reassurance from someone who did not look at me with the terrifying intensity Julian often did. Dr. Evelyn Vance was a warm woman with kind eyes, exactly the sort of doctor I needed to calm my nerves. She applied the cold gel to my stomach with a gentle touch, chatting idly about the gloomy weather. The room was dimly lit and peaceful, filled with the soft, rhythmic whooshing sound of the ultrasound machine. I relaxed for the first time in weeks, watching the grainy black and white imagery on the monitor. Then everything changed in a heartbeat. Dr. Vance stopped moving the transducer. Her hand froze right over the base of my uterus. I watched the easy smile vanish from her face, replaced instantly by a mask of sheer confusion that quickly deepened into horror. The silence in the room became heavy and suffocating. She did not say a word. She simply reached out, switched off the monitor facing me so the screen went black, and stood up abruptly. Before I could ask what was wrong, she walked to the door and locked it with a sharp click. My breath caught in my throat. "We have to act now," Dr. Vance whispered, her voice trembling but laced with a steeliness I did not expect. "Is it the baby?" I asked, my hands flying to my stomach to protect the life inside. "Is something wrong with her?" Dr. Vance shook her head violently. She turned the monitor back toward me, but she did not point to the small, curled form of my daughter. Instead, she pointed to a dark shadow nestled deep within the uterine wall, dangerously close to the amniotic sac. It was not organic, even to my untrained eyes. The lines were too straight, too precise. It was a sharp, hexagonal shape that glowed with a faint, rhythmic heat signal on the screen. "That is not a tumor, Elena," she said, her voice dropping to a terrified hush. "That is artificial." "It is metal!" I tried to laugh, to dismiss it as a glitch in the machine. But the bile rising in my throat choked me. Dr. Vance adjusted the contrast. The horror became vivid. The hexagonal object had tiny, needle-like appendages extending from its core, digging into my tissue like the roots of a parasitic tree. It was pulsing, drawing blood from my arteries to power itself. "It is feeding on you," she said bluntly. "It is a sophisticated parasitic technology. Elena, listen to me carefully. Have you had any abdominal surgeries? Any at all?" My mind reeled, grasping for memories through the shock. "Just one," I stammered. 2 years ago. My appendix burst. Julian did the surgery himself. He said it was an emergency and he could not trust anyone else to operate on me." The color drained from Dr. Vance's face completely. The timeline fit perfectly. That was right before we got married. "He did not remove your appendix," she said, the realization landing between us like a physical blow. "He planted this inside you. He has been waiting for this pregnancy." The increased blood flow and hormonal changes of gestation were the biological trigger codes needed to activate the device. My world fractured. The loving husband who blended my smoothies and rubbed my feet had treated my body not as a temple, but as a storage unit for some grotesque experiment. I started to hyperventilate, the room spinning as the betrayal shattered my reality. Breathe, Dr. Vance commanded. She moved quickly, uncapping a syringe. I am giving you a mild sedative. Do not fight it. Panic will kill you right now, and we need you lucid but calm. We have to get you out of here before he realizes you know. I felt the sharp prick of the needle in my arm, and as the chemical calm began to wash over me, I realized the man I slept next to every night was a monster. And I was carrying his ticking time bomb. The drive back to our secluded lake house felt like a journey into the belly of a beast. The sedative Dr. Vance had given me kept my hands steady on the wheel, but it could not silence the screaming in my mind. The windshield wipers slashed back and forth against the torrential Seattle rain, a hypnotic rhythm that dragged me into the past. Suddenly, every act of love Julian had shown me over the last 2 years twisted into something grotesque. I thought about the green smoothies he prepared for me every single morning. He never let me make them myself. He would stand there, watching me drink every drop with that intense, doting smile, insisting they were full of rare micronutrients essential for the baby. I remembered the faint, metallic aftertaste that lingered on my tongue, a taste I had dismissed as iron supplements. Now I knew better. I was not feeding a child. I was fueling a machine. Then there was his mother, Beatrice. She did not look at me like a daughter-in-law. She looked at me like an asset manager inspecting a high-yield vault. She would visit unannounced, her cold hands pressing hard against my abdomen, her eyes devoid of warmth. I recalled a chilling moment from last month when she thought I was out of earshot. She had told Julian that the casing had to remain intact until the day of the harvest. At the time, I assumed she was using a strange, aristocratic metaphor for the birth of her grandchild. Now the word harvest made my blood run cold. Every time I complained of sharp pains in my lower abdomen or dizzy spells, Julian was there with his soothing voice and his medical bag. He would tell me it was just the ligaments stretching or normal pregnancy fatigue. Then came the injections. Small, unlabeled vials of clear liquid he claimed were custom vitamin blends available only to top-tier physicians. I had trusted him implicitly. Why would I not trust the most sought-after obstetrician in the state? He was not treating my pain. He was sedating my body's rejection of the foreign object he had violated me with. I pulled through the massive iron gates of our estate. Julian had installed a security system worthy of a fortress 6 months ago, claiming we needed to protect the air from potential kidnappers. I realized now the cameras and motion sensors were not there to keep people out. They were there to keep me in. I parked the car and took a deep breath, forcing my facial muscles into a mask of tired happiness. I had to play the role. Julian met me at the front door before I even turned the key. He looked perfect, wearing a cashmere sweater and that practiced look of concern. He asked where I had been. He knew my schedule better than I did. I lied and told him I had driven to the fabric district to look at blackout curtains for the nursery. My voice remained steady. Thank God for the sedative, but I saw a flicker of something sharp and dangerous in his eyes. He did not blink. He looked at my coat, damp from the rain, and asked why I had not taken the driver he hired. I told him I just needed some air. He stared at me for a second too long before smiling, but the warmth did not reach his eyes. That night was the longest of my life. I lay in our bed, feigning sleep, my breathing shallow and controlled. Julian slid into bed beside me. His hand moved under my silk nightgown and rested on my stomach. It was a gesture that used to make me feel safe, loved. Now, I felt like a specimen in a jar. His fingers did not caress the baby. They probed deep, pressing firmly against the spot where Dr. Vance had shown me the hexagon. He was checking the placement of his investment. He lingered there, tracing the outline of the abomination inside me. A wave of nausea rolled through me, not from morning sickness, but from the sheer violation of it all, to him and to his mother. I was not a wife or a mother. I was nothing more than a biological incubator, a living container for their insanity, waiting to be discarded once they extracted what they really wanted. The call came at 6 in the morning, piercing the silence of the house like a gunshot. It was the diversion Dr. Vance had promised. She had arranged for a colleague to page Julian with a high-risk emergency at the hospital, a case too complex for anyone else to handle. I watched from the bedroom window as Julian rushed to his car, his face set in a mask of professional concern, completely unaware that the real emergency was right here in the house he had turned into a prison. As soon as his taillights disappeared around the bend, I sprang into action. My target was his study, a room strictly forbidden to me, secured by a biometric fingerprint lock. I knew I had very little time. I ran to the kitchen island where his half-finished espresso still sat. I had seen him do this to me a dozen times, using my thumb to unlock my phone while I feigned sleep. So I knew the theory. I grabbed a roll of clear packing tape from the utility drawer. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it, but I forced myself to focus. Carefully, I pressed a strip of tape over the smudge his thumb had left on the ceramic mug, praying the oils were distinct enough. I peeled it back slowly. There was a faint, ghostly impression of ridges. I ran to the heavy oak door of his study and smoothed the tape over the scanner. I held my breath. The light blinked red once. I adjusted the angle, smoothing out an air bubble, and tried again. The mechanism clicked, the light turned green, and the lock disengaged. I pushed the door open and gasped. The room was freezing, kept at a temperature suitable for servers, not humans. But it was the wall opposite the desk that made my stomach churn. It was covered in high-definition monitors. They showed every room in the house, the kitchen, the living room, our bedroom, and even the bathroom. He had been watching me, every private moment, every shower, every time I cried alone. He had been watching. The sickness of it almost paralyzed me, but I pushed forward. I went straight for the large oil painting of us on our wedding day. It was a cliché hiding spot, but Julian was a creature of ego. I swung the frame aside, revealing a sleek, digital safe. I needed a code. I tried his birthday. Nothing. I tried our anniversary. Error. Then I realized what mattered most to him. It was not me. It was the harvest. I punched in the 6 digits of our baby's due date. The safe beeped and popped open. Inside, there was no money or jewelry, only a thick stack of files and a hard drive. The folder on top was labeled in clinical block letters, Host 01. I opened it, and the first page was a copy of my own medical records, but my name was barely mentioned. Instead, the documents referred to the Chimera key. As I flipped through the technical schematics, a name caught my eye. It was my father. My father had been a brilliant biochemical engineer who died under mysterious circumstances 5 years ago. The police had ruled it a heart attack, but these papers told a different story. He had invented a biological compound worth billions of dollars, a formula that could revolutionize medicine, but he had hidden the source code inside a microscopic device to keep it from falling into the wrong hands. Julian and his mother had not just bought the hospital where my father died. They had hunted down his work. They discovered that the compound needed a living, pregnant human host to synthesize and mature. I found the timeline titled Harvest Protocol. It was a detailed schedule: implantation during appendectomy, activation during gestation. And then, the end game. The plan called for an emergency cesarean section at week 36. The final bullet point made me cover my mouth to stifle a scream. It read, induce post-operative hemorrhage to facilitate device retrieval. Disposal of host 01 via natural complications. They were going to let me bleed to death on the table. I pulled out my phone and started snapping photos of every page, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had just finished photographing the diagram of the device when a sound froze my blood. It was the distinct crunch of tires rolling over the gravel in the driveway. I glanced at the surveillance monitor on the wall. A black sedan had just pulled up. It was not Julian. It was Beatrice. She was hours early. I shoved the files back into the safe with trembling hands and slammed the heavy metal door shut. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird as I frantically wiped my fingerprints off the scanner with the sleeve of my sweater. I slipped out of the study and softly closed the door just as the sharp, rhythmic clicking of stiletto heels echoed from the marble foyer. I leaned against the wall, taking a shallow breath to steady myself before walking into the living room. Beatrice was standing there, shaking her umbrella with an air of irritation. Beside her stood a man I had never seen before. He was tall, gaunt, and carried a black medical bag. Beatrice did not even greet me. She simply gestured to the stranger and introduced him as my new private physician, claiming he was a specialist flown in to administer a potent nutrient blend for the baby. I looked at the man, and then at the syringe he was already preparing. The liquid inside was a vibrant, unnatural blue. I knew instantly that this was not a vitamin. It was an accelerant for the Chimera key, a chemical designed to push the device into overdrive, regardless of what it did to my body. I clutched my stomach and feigned a violent gag. I told them I was going to be sick and needed a moment. Before Beatrice could object, I rushed into the powder room and locked the door. My fingers flew across my phone screen as I typed 2 words to Dr. Vance code red. The reply came 10 seconds later. She told me to get out immediately and that a private ambulance was waiting at the rear service gate. I took a deep breath, unlocked the bathroom door, and walked back out. The fake doctor was waiting with the needle uncapped. I approached him slowly, acting as if I was resigned to my fate. But when I was within arm's reach, I grabbed the heavy stainless steel tray of medical instruments on the side table and swung it with all my strength. The metal clang was deafening as the tray smashed into Beatrice and the doctor, sending scalpels and vials crashing to the floor. Beatrice shrieked in shock, giving me the split second I needed. I sprinted for the back door, kicking off my slippers as I ran. I burst out into the storm, my bare feet slapping against the cold, wet stone of the patio. The house alarm began to wail, a piercing siren that cut through the sound of the rain. I ran toward the rear gate, the mud slick under my feet, soaking my clothes instantly. I could see the gate ahead, my freedom just 50 yards away. Then I skidded to a halt. Julian was standing there. He had not gone to the hospital. He had circled back, his suspicion evidently outweighing his duty. He stood blocking the only exit, drenched in rain. But he did not look like the man who had vowed to protect me. The mask had fallen completely. His face was twisted into a sneer of pure, cold malice. In his right hand, he held a syringe filled with a clear liquid, undoubtedly a sedative strong enough to knock out a horse. He took a step toward me, blocking the path. He told me I was being hysterical and needed to sleep. He raised the syringe, his eyes dead and predatory. I backed up until my spine hit the brick wall of the garden perimeter. He lunged at me, expecting a frightened, helpless, pregnant woman. He was wrong. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the canister of pepper spray I had bought months ago and hidden for a moment just like this. I aimed it directly at his eyes and pressed down on the trigger. A stream of burning orange chemical hit him square in the face. Julian screamed, dropping the syringe and clutching his eyes as he fell to his knees, blinded and choking. I did not look back. I scrambled past him, threw open the heavy iron gate, and threw myself into the back of the waiting ambulance just as the engine roared to life. The ambulance swerved violently as Dr. Vance took a sharp corner, the tires screaming against the wet asphalt. Through the rain-streaked rear window, I saw the blinding LED headlights of 2 black SUVs cutting through the storm. They were gaining on us. Beatrice had unleashed her private security detail, and they were driving with a recklessness that screamed they had orders to stop us at any cost. Dr. Vance gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, her eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. She shouted over the roar of the engine that she had been my father's student years ago. She told me she never believed his death was a simple heart attack. When she saw my name appear on her appointment registry, she knew it was her chance to uncover the truth and protect the only family he had left. We sped toward the crowded market district, weaving through the heavy traffic. Dr. Vance swung the ambulance into a narrow loading alley, momentarily breaking the line of sight with our pursuers. We abandoned the vehicle and jumped into a nondescript gray sedan that had been parked there with the engine running. By the time the security team swarmed the empty ambulance, we were miles away, merging invisibly into the highway traffic. 20 minutes later, we arrived at a secluded industrial complex. Robert, my father's oldest friend and a brilliant attorney, ushered us into a reinforced underground bunker beneath his office. The room was lined with servers and stacks of legal files. Robert wasted no time. He uploaded the photos I had taken in Julian's study onto a large monitor. The atmosphere in the room shifted from frantic to grave as he analyzed the schematics of the Chimera key. He pointed to a terrifying detail in the blueprints. The device was not just floating in my uterus. It had anchored itself directly onto my abdominal aorta. Robert explained that if anyone tried to remove the device without the precise surgical protocol, it would tear the artery, and I would bleed out in less than 60 seconds. Julian had turned my own circulatory system into a hostage. Robert then pulled up a digital file showing that Julian had forged a power of attorney and a living will in my name. The moment I died on that operating table, my entire inheritance and the patent rights would transfer to him. However, as Robert scrolled through the technical data, he found an anomaly. My father had built a failsafe into the hardware. If the host's heart stopped beating before the encryption code was entered, the device would trigger an electromagnetic pulse and erase all the data instantly. Julian had the unlock code, but he did not have the data yet. I sat back in the chair, a cold realization washing over me. This was my leverage. Julian could not kill me. He needed my heart to keep beating until he could perform the extraction surgery. If I died, his billion-dollar miracle cure died with me. I looked at Dr. Vance and Robert. I told them I was done hiding. I was not going to let them hunt me down like an animal. I was going to use my life as the ultimate weapon. Julian was hosting a massive charity gala at his private hospital tonight to raise money for his research. It was the perfect stage. I told them we were going back to the hospital, not as victims, but as executioners of his reputation. We were going to crash the party. I zipped up the back of the emerald green evening gown Robert had procured for me. The heavy silk draped elegantly over my swollen belly, concealing the life I was fighting for and the death trap planted beside it. Dr. Vance adjusted the clasp of my necklace, which concealed a high-fidelity microphone and a GPS tracker linked directly to a secure server Robert was monitoring. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and warned me again that this was suicide. If Julian realized I had turned on him, he would not hesitate to cut me open right there on the ballroom floor. I told her I knew, but I also knew that the only way to destroy a monster was to let him swallow you whole and then tear him apart from the inside. The grand ballroom of Serenity Private Hospital was a sea of diamonds and champagne. The city's elite had gathered to celebrate Julian's brilliance, completely unaware of the butchery behind his success. When I walked through the double doors, the room went silent. Julian was mid-toast, holding a crystal flute, with Beatrice beaming beside him. Their smiles froze instantly. For a split second, I saw pure, unadulterated panic in their eyes. I did not give them a chance to recover. I walked straight to the podium, took the microphone from Julian's stiff hand, and addressed the crowd. I spoke of my husband's dedication, his tireless work, and the special gift he had given me, a gift that required the ultimate sacrifice. The crowd applauded my devotion, thinking it was a metaphor for love. Julian knew I was talking about my murder. He had to stand there, arm around my waist, smiling for the cameras, trapped by his own public image. But as the applause died down, he leaned in to kiss my cheek. His lips brushed my ear, and he whispered that I had made a grave mistake. He promised me that my death would be slow and that he would make sure I felt every incision. Still smiling for the photographers, he signaled to two large men in dark suits standing by the exit. He announced to the guests that the excitement was too much for me and that I needed to rest. The men flanked me instantly, their grips like iron on my arms, guiding me not to the exit, but toward the private VIP elevators. Beatrice followed us inside. As soon as the metal doors slid shut, cutting us off from the safety of the public eye, the pretense evaporated. She slapped me hard across the face, the ring on her finger cutting my lip. She screamed that I was an ungrateful vessel. In her rage, she became careless. She hissed that my father had been a stubborn fool who refused to sell, so she had to poison his evening tea to get the formula. She admitted she had killed him, only to find his lab empty because he had already hidden the chimera key inside his own daughter. My hand rested on my stomach, right over the hidden recorder, ensuring every word of her confession was being transmitted to Robert. The elevator did not stop at the penthouse suites. It plummeted down, past the lobby, past the basement, into the sublevels that did not exist on the building plans. The doors opened with a sterile chime. The air was freezing and smelled of antiseptic and dread. It was a state-of-the-art surgical theater, gleaming with chrome and cold light. A team of scrubbed doctors and nurses stood waiting in silence, their faces hidden behind masks. They were not there to save a life. They were there to harvest a product. The leather straps dug into my wrists and ankles, pinning me to the cold steel of the operating table. Julian did not order general anesthesia. Instead, he administered a massive dose of local anesthetic directly into my abdominal wall, numbing the skin but leaving me terrified and wide awake. He leaned over me, his surgical mask pulling tight against his face, and told me calmly that he wanted me to witness the moment his legacy was born. He explained the procedure with the detached precision of a mechanic fixing an engine. First, he would deliver our daughter. Then, he would perform a radical hysterectomy to extract the chimera key embedded in my uterine wall. After that, he would simply nick the uterine artery and let nature take its course. I would bleed out in minutes, a tragic complication of childbirth, while he walked away with the patent worth billions. Beatrice stood at the foot of the table, practically vibrating with greed. She checked her diamond watch and snapped at Julian to hurry up before the police realized what was happening. Julian raised the scalpel, the blade gleaming under the harsh surgical lights. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought they would crack. I screamed at him to stop. I told him that if my heart stopped beating before he entered the code, the device would self-destruct and erase the formula instantly. Julian froze. The blade hovered inches from my skin. He was a man of science. He knew my father's genius, and he knew it was entirely possible that my father had rigged the device to die with the host. Doubt flickered in his eyes. But Beatrice laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the tiled walls. She yelled that I was lying, desperate to save my skin, and ordered him to cut immediately. Julian tightened his grip on the scalpel, his ambition outweighing his caution. But before the metal could touch my skin, the room plunged into absolute darkness. Dr. Vance, who had infiltrated the room disguised behind a surgical mask and scrub cap in the corner, had severed the main power line. Chaos erupted. The backup generators took 10 seconds to kick in, and in that blindness, I felt a hand yank the strap on my right wrist. It was loose. Vance had rigged the buckle while prepping me moments earlier. I ripped my arm free, then my left, and rolled my heavy body off the table just as the emergency red floodlights bathed the room in a hellish glow. I hit the floor hard, the impact jarring my body, and dragged myself backward. Julian roared in frustration. He spotted me trying to crawl toward the door and lunged. He grabbed a handful of my hair, yanking my head back so hard I saw stars. He was not the refined doctor anymore. He was a feral animal losing his prize. He swung the scalpel wildly, aiming for my throat. I reached out blindly and grabbed a heavy stainless steel instrument tray from a rolling cart. I brought it up just as the blade came down. Metal shrieked against metal, sparks flying in the dim red light. The force of his blow vibrated down my arm, but I held firm. As he raised his arm for a second strike, I summoned every ounce of rage I had buried for 2 years. I kicked out with my legs, aiming for his groin. My heel connected solidly. Julian's eyes bulged, and he collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, the scalpel clattering across the tiled floor. Beatrice fumbled with the clasp of her designer handbag, her fingers slick with sweat and panic. She ripped open the leather flap and pulled out a small, silver automatic pistol. The sight of the weapon in the hands of a woman who usually only held champagne flutes was jarring, but the lethal intent in her eyes was terrifyingly real. She leveled the barrel at my legs, screaming over the hum of the medical equipment that she would shatter my kneecaps so I could never take another step. Her finger tightened on the trigger, trembling with adrenaline. I braced myself for the bullet, but before she could fire, the room exploded into chaos. A deafening siren shattered the air, vibrating in my chest. The fire suppression system activated instantly, and jets of freezing cold water rained down from the ceiling, soaking the sterile operating room in seconds. Robert had done it. He had hacked the building's central nervous system. I knew that at this exact moment, 50 floors above us, the giant screens in the ballroom were broadcasting the audio recording of Beatrice confessing to my father's murder. The socialites and investors were listening to the matriarch of the Thorne family admit to poisoning a man for profit. Outside the heavy steel doors of the operating theater, I heard the unmistakable thud of battering rams and the shouting of voices. The SWAT team was breaching the perimeter. The empire Julian and Beatrice had built on lies was collapsing around them, literally and metaphorically. Julian looked at the door, then at his mother, and finally at me. The facade of the composed, brilliant surgeon shattered completely. He snapped. He lunged at Beatrice and ripped the gun from her wet grip, shoving her aside so hard she slipped on the flooded tile floor. He did not turn to face the police. He turned back to me. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, the look of a man who had lost everything and wanted only to destroy what was left. He aimed the gun directly at my stomach, right at the center of the hexagonal outline beneath my skin. "If I cannot have it," he roared, his voice cracking with insanity, "then no one can—" He was going to kill his own child just to destroy the technology he could not possess. I did not beg. I did not cry. I looked straight into the eyes of the man I had once vowed to love and realized he was nothing more than an obstacle. I remembered the final failsafe my father had coded into the device, a weaponized frequency designed for this exact moment of desperation. I took a deep breath and shouted the command clearly over the wailing sirens. "Protocol Omega." The reaction was instantaneous. A high-pitched, vibrating hum erupted from my abdomen, a sonic resonance so intense it felt like my bones were vibrating. It was not just a sound, it was an electronic jamming signal. The lights overhead flickered and burst. The heart monitors exploded in sparks. But the effect on Julian was catastrophic. He screamed and dropped the gun, clapping his hands over his ears. He fell to his knees, writhing in agony in the water. He was wearing a sophisticated amplified earpiece connected to the hospital's security network, and the sonic pulse was feeding a feedback loop of agonizing noise directly into his skull. My father had turned the device into a defensive siren. Julian was incapacitated, blinded by pain and disoriented by the sonic assault. I saw the syringe of heavy sedative floating in the water near the table leg. It was the same dose he had prepared to knock me out so he could cut me open. I snatched it up, uncapped the needle, and lunged at him. He tried to push me away, but his coordination was gone. I jammed the needle into the side of his neck and slammed the plunger down with all the force of a mother defending her young. His eyes rolled back in his head, the scream dying in his throat, and he collapsed face first into the water. The heavy steel doors of the operating theater finally buckled under the relentless force of the battering ram. A team of tactical officers swarmed into the flooded room, their boots splashing through the inch of water that covered the floor. They moved with a terrifying efficiency, their rifles raised and voices booming commands that echoed off the tiled walls. I lay shivering on the cold, wet floor, clutching my stomach, watching the empire of lies crumble in real time. Julian was barely conscious. The heavy sedative I had injected into his neck was dragging him down into a stupor, causing him to sway drunkenly as the officers grabbed him. They slammed him against the wet wall, twisting his arms behind his back until the handcuffs clicked shut with a sound of finality. Beatrice was not going quietly. She was shrieking, a high, piercing sound of absolute despair that made my skin crawl. She clawed at the uniforms of the officers who hauled her up, her expensive designer gown ruined by the sprinkler water, her dignity stripped away to reveal the rotting, greedy core underneath. Dr. Vance was at my side instantly. Her hands were warm and professional as she checked my pulse and pressed gently on my abdomen to assess the baby. She told me that both the baby and I were safe for the moment, but her expression tightened when she felt my stomach harden under her touch. The extreme stress, the physical trauma, and the adrenaline crash had triggered early labor. My water had not broken yet, but the contractions were starting, sharp, rhythmic, and undeniable. As the police dragged Julian to his feet, he looked right through me. His eyes were empty, devoid of any human connection or recognition. He was mumbling to himself, reciting chemical equations and molecular structures in a frantic whisper, his mind snapping under the weight of his failure. He did not care that he was going to prison for life. He only cared that his experiment had been interrupted before completion. Beatrice was dragged past me next, kicking and screaming like a banshee. She reached out, her fingers hooking into the air like talons, cursing me and the child I carried. She screamed that we were thieves, that we belonged to her, and that we had stolen her legacy. The chaos spilled out into the hallway near the elevator banks. The doors slid open, and a collective gasp ran through the crowd. The wealthy guests from the gala upstairs, along with a horde of hungry reporters who had sniffed out the scandal after Robert released the audio, had descended to the lower levels to see the commotion. They expected a tour of a state-of-the-art facility. Instead, they saw the illustrious Thorne family in handcuffs, soaked in water and blood, looking like monsters. Camera flashes erupted like lightning storms, capturing the disgrace for the morning papers. Paramedics lifted me onto a gurney, strapping me in securely. As they wheeled me toward the exit, I asked them to stop for a brief second. We were right next to Julian. He was slumped against the wall, held up by two officers, looking at the floor. I looked at the man who had shared my bed, the man who had sliced into me with a scalpel moments ago. "You loved an object more than your wife and child," I said, my voice weak but steady enough for the cameras to catch every syllable. "Now you will lose everything." Julian did not answer. He just stared at my stomach, his face crumbling. He did not look sorry. He looked insulted. He was devastated not because he had lost his family, but because he had been outsmarted by the vessel he deemed inferior. He slumped forward, a broken man defeated by his own hubris. The paramedics rushed me out to the waiting ambulance. This time, it was not a private vehicle owned by the Thornes. It was a neutral ambulance from the city, flanked by police cruisers and Dr. Vance. As the doors closed, shutting out the flashing lights and the screaming press, I felt the ambulance lurch forward toward the university hospital. The nightmare in the house was over, but the battle for my life was just entering its final, most dangerous stage. The university hospital was a fortress of white walls and genuine care, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile prison Julian had built. The contractions ripped through me with a ferocity that took my breath away, but for the first time in months, the pain felt purposeful rather than punitive. I was not being harvested, I was giving birth. Dr. Vance was there, leading a team of the state's top trauma surgeons. They had a dual mission. They had to deliver my daughter safely, and they had to extract the chimera key without triggering the fatal hemorrhage Julian had designed as my exit strategy. I was wheeled into the operating room, but this time, the faces above the masks were kind. The anesthesia pulled me under, but not before I whispered a promise to the life kicking inside me that we would both make it. The surgery was a blur of lights and voices. I drifted in and out of consciousness, tethered to reality only by the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Then, a sound cut through the haze. It was a high, indignant cry. My daughter was here. She was alive, and she was loud, but the relief was short-lived. The steady rhythm of the monitors suddenly accelerated into a chaotic alarm. I heard Dr. Vance shout for more suction and blood products. The removal of the device had torn a fragile vessel in the uterine wall. Just as we had feared, I felt cold, a deep, creeping chill that started in my toes and raced toward my chest. The room started to dim around the edges. The voices of the doctors became distant echoes, sounding like they were underwater. I was bleeding out. In that space between life and death, the darkness did not feel scary. It felt warm. I saw my father standing there, wearing his old lab coat, looking exactly as I remembered him before the sickness took him. He did not look at my stomach. He looked at my face. He smiled and told me that I was never a vessel. He said I was a guardian. He told me to go back because my shift was not over yet. I gasped, filling my lungs with air that smelled of antiseptic and life. The darkness receded. The alarms had stopped. The bleeding had been stemmed. When I fully woke up, I was in a private recovery room. The morning sun was just starting to bleed through the blinds, painting the room in soft gold. Robert was sitting in the corner, looking exhausted but triumphant. On the table next to him sat a heavy evidence bag containing the chimera key, sealed with red tape. It looked small and insignificant now, just a piece of metal that had almost cost me everything. Robert told me the news in a quiet voice. Julian and Beatrice were currently being processed at the Central Precinct. They were facing multiple life sentences for attempted murder, kidnapping, and gross medical malpractice. The entire Thorne family estate had been frozen by the federal government. Robert also revealed the final secret of the device. Once extracted, the encryption unlocked a video file from my father. His wish was never for the formula to be sold. He wanted it to be open source, free for every hospital in the world to cure the sick. We were going to honor that wish. I turned my head to the glass bassinet beside my bed. My daughter was sleeping soundly, her tiny chest rising and falling in a perfect rhythm. I reached out and wrapped my finger around her miniature hand. She squeezed back, a reflex that felt like a promise. Outside the window, the sun broke over the Seattle skyline, burning away the storm clouds that had followed me for so long. I took a deep breath, feeling the soreness in my body not as damage, but as victory. For the first time in 2 years, my heart beat only for me and the people I chose to love. My body and my life finally belonged to me again. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please comment down below and let me know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and smash that hype button to help this story reach even more people.